All right, good morning or good afternoon. Here is your part 2 of your Major Western Art Movements video lecture. So last time we left off at Surrealism. Okay, so we went through basically the shift that occurred in 1816, which was when the camera was invented. So art changed dramatically after that point. It was a turning point in history. And then we talked a little bit about what it was like before the 1800s. We moved into neoclassicism, romanticism, and then we start talking about, sorry, I just realized that my face is covering up all of this. How art changed from the 1800s on. Okay, and so Surrealism is where we left off. We talked about how it is supposed to express imaginative dreams, visions from free from conscious rational control. So the subconscious is of paramount importance here, which is why the images are so wild. It's called surreal for a reason. It doesn't feel real, and yet here we are looking at it. Okay, so the traits that we talked about are here, and those are the definitive sort of genre traits of Surrealism. So if we go back to that PowerPoint where we talked about art appreciation, we wanted to say something critical about this painting. So like if we wanted to be able to analyze the way that it falls into form, or analyze its subject matter, or whatever, these are the things that we'd be looking for. Does it show a demented sense of humor? Maybe not this one. But is it absurd? Yes. Are there odd or absurd scales and perspectives? Absolutely. Is there chaos and juxtapositioning? Yes. We don't normally see a train coming out of a fireplace. It's irrational, it lacks sense, right? So this fits into the subject matter and genre of Surrealism when we go back and apply those art appreciation and criticism terms that we talked about in the previous PowerPoints and lectures. We talked about Salvador Dali and the persistence of memory, and we went through a few of these, okay? And I think we ended here. Right, so the re-emergent Dadaism of the millennial generation, which is basically encapsulated by y'all's use of memes, right? So this may sound crazy, but I'm pretty sure in 20, 30, 50 years from now, there will be people whose job is to analyze the role of memes in dealing with cultural shifts, because it is your version of surrealist art. Okay. It has its own language, it has its own image, and sort of symbology. It's really quite interesting. But here are some ways that a surrealist would paint apples. And again, if you if I'm going too fast for this, it's because you probably missed part 1, so you need to go back and watch that. I'm trying to remember what I did last year with that. I don't remember. So Impressionism, which is my personal favorite. Okay. Its job is to capture the visual impressions of a moment in time. Nick Ruiz, I believe this was the painting you did your art memoir on, and you called the sun a spicy pepperoni. So there you go. Your impression of the sun in this case is spicy pepperoni. Okay, and this is by Monet, Claude Monet. And this one is also by Claude Monet. He is one of the most probably renowned Impressionists, and they just had an exhibit of his at the Denver Art Museum, and I was hoping that we could have made it, but I think it ended before we got a chance, and absolutely now we can't go, but it's okay. There's always next year, okay? Impressionists were interested in the passing of time, so looking at a single subject, like for example in this case it's a woman and presumably her son, and watching the passing of time and how that shifts or changes what she looks like. Okay? Capturing a glimpse or an impression of an object or subject in time. Lights and shadow, huge. Light and shadow and how it hits particular subject matters at different times of day. So Monet would often sit in one place throughout hours and over days, right? He'd go back to that same place and look at how light and time and weather affected the way that the object looked and affected his impression of that object. It was usually everyday people and places, vivid but accurate colors, little to no black or white, and really quite ordinary subjects, but with unusual visual angles, right? So this is a pretty unusual angle for, a portrait. He's looking up, right, at this woman, rather than straight on like normal portraiture would. This is 1875, so this is post-romanticism. Here are a few other impressionist pieces. So let's start here, the ballet class. This is Degas, and Degas was at the Denver Art Museum a couple years back. Okay, here's another one, Dancers in Pink, Degas, impressionistic. You can see, like, we know what they are. It's realistic enough to be able to tell that these are dancers. He gets the human form right and the angles and the perspective, but it's still impressionistic because it's not hyper detailed. It's not hyper realistic. Same thing with this Edouard Manet, different than Monet. It's impressionistic. It's casual. These dancers aren't even dancing yet. These people aren't doing anything like hugely influential. They're just sitting in a boat. Okay? And that's the sort of defining characteristics of Impressionism, is getting the impression of an ordinary moment and finding the beauty in it. It's probably why it's my favorite movement. The other thing that it's particularly good at capturing, and you don't necessarily see it in here, but movement. Capturing the movement of an object, even though this painting is obviously not moving. No, I can't remember if I have an example of that in here, but hopefully I can show you one. Cézanne and another Claude Monet. Still life, okay, so obviously movement isn't being captured here, but what is being captured here is light and perspective and color. Okay. Again, not hyper-realistic, but we can tell what these are. Okay. Probably a bottle of wine, some apples, maybe some pears, and what look like eclairs, but are probably just like breadsticks or some sort of pastry. And then his sunflowers. One of the central artists, as we've talked about, is Claude Monet. An Impression sunrise is the one that is pictured here. So it is what inspired the name of the movement. Okay, so this is his impression of the sunrise. And this is probably just the epitome of impressionistic art. Okay? We can tell what it is, but it is absolutely boiled down to its most impressionistic form here. And this is Claude Monet. Some other famous ones we talked about: Degas, Renoir, Marie Cassatt. It's mostly French, if you notice, Degas, Monet, Renoir, Cassatt. We often talked about Van Gogh as being an impressionist, but he's technically at the very end of Impressionism when it's moving into Fauvism. So we'll notice the difference between like Degas and Monet's Impressionism and what Van Gogh does with it. He obviously has characteristics of an impressionist artist, but he also borrows from what's called Fauvism, which we're going to talk about, and you can kind of see that mirrored in his those two things mirrored in his work. And this goes back to that art appreciation PowerPoint, right? We can see the progression of art styles and movements if we understand the subject matter, the form, and the characteristics that define those movements, and we can start we can sound really educated and be like, ah, yes, Van Gogh, like he borrowed from the Impressionists, but he also borrowed from the Fauvists, because we can see this in his use of color or his use of perspective. We can see that Picasso took Fauvism and then made it his own and made it into this super abstract technique, right? So what we're getting is a cultural literacy and cultural vernacular, so we can engage with art that we may not fully understand, but at least have a foundational understanding of it so we can appreciate it. Okay, this is a series of Monet's haystacks, and they're probably, apart from his lily pads, these are probably the most significant or most known subjects that he paints. And he literally, this is just a a study that he does of haystacks. When we say study, it means that he has dedicated days and hours to looking at a single subject and capturing how it looks under different circumstances. So we see it in the winter. We see it probably, I would say this is spring. This is fall. Okay. When the light changes, when his perspective shifts, probably still spring, maybe summer. Winter, fall, winter, at night or at sunset. Okay. And this is when the sun is setting as well. You can see the shadow. Probably more spring, maybe summer. Okay. The colors are different, but it's the same thing. It's a haystack. Okay. That's Impressionism's goal. Okay. You can see the individual brushstrokes if we had a better resolution. And this is how, if we go back to that first question, how many different ways are there to paint an apple? This is how an impressionist would paint or draw an apple. Same here, some pears in there. These are all examples of what an impressionist would. And this one right here is actually touching on a little bit of Fauvism, which we're almost there. We're almost to Fauvism. Realism. Exactly what it sounds like, so we'll breeze through this. It's painting things as realistically as possible. And then we have these realism examples, and then we have hyper-realism, which is like photorealism, which we'll talk about. The features of realism include accuracy, honesty, so portraying what you see, flaws and all, ordinariness of the subject, everyday lives of the working class, not the important, not the rich. I say important as in the people making decisions on behalf of the working class. These are everyday people, the backbone of society, who don't get credit for being the backbone of society. Okay? Difficulties of a situation are shown, perhaps showing its bleakness or complexity, and it's inspired by the Industrial Revolution and the growing working class. Obviously, it's inspired by the invention of photography, which enables us to capture things realistically. And it was supposed to show political and social importance of the working class. Like, let's capture real life as it is. Let's capture these people working their butts off to make sure that we have food to eat, right? Let's show the backbone of our economy. Quite fitting. If we were to have a bunch of realist artists now, we would be seeing a lot of, well, actually we do see a lot of photographs and artwork of people who are carrying us right now through this pandemic. Okay. Realism can be sculpture as well. We focus a lot on painting in here, but here's an example of a Greek sculpture inspired by an old peasant woman. It's realistic and it's realism. Hard times. See a woman nursing her baby, exhausted, her child exhausted. They're probably migrant workers. This is obviously different, right? So this is Edward Hopper, just capturing everyday life of everyday people at a diner. Norman, that's supposed to say Norman, not normal. Norman Rockwell. This one's really interesting. We have a juxtaposition of images here. Also, this looks exactly like my dog, Cora, but I digress. And then hyperrealism, based on using the camera and photographs to gather information and then creating artwork that looks like a high-resolution photo. Obviously, incredibly technical. This is a difficult genre to master, but it's really popular right now, actually. You can find a lot of these online, photorealistic artwork. I think this one baffles me, down to like the follicles and pores on his face. I would pause it and look at this. You can also pull it up on the PowerPoint and zoom in. Let's see if I, oh, I did zoom it in. Okay. And then here's how a realist would draw or paint an apple. I'm going to leave it here, and we're wrapping up this section of the PowerPoint because I'm almost out of time. We'll pick up on Pointillism next.